Then we'll move on to the next item after this. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Jeremy Fress with the Legislative Analyst's Office. Our office has raised a few issues for legislative consideration on the use of the cap-and-trade revenues for the high-speed rail program. And the first is we find that the high-speed rail may not maximize the greenhouse gas reductions. The legislature may want to consider its full range of options in terms of achieving the goals of AB 32 and also meeting the legislative priorities. In terms of the cap-and-trade auction revenues as a funding source for high-speed rail, we find that according to the business plan of the High-Speed Rail Authority, there's currently a $21 billion shortfall to complete the initial operating segment from the Central Valley to the Los Angeles Basin. And in terms of if the cap-and-trade auction revenues will be sufficient to address this shortfall, because we're not seeing from the administration any estimates about what exactly the revenue the cap-and-trade auctions will bring in over the next few years, it's difficult for the legislature to determine if the auction revenues will be sufficient to address this shortfall. And so we recommend the legislature require the administration to come forward with a full funding plan for this initial operating segment that outlines all the sources of revenue that will be used, the Proposition 1A, the federal funds, the cap-and-trade funds, if those revenues will be sufficient in every year to cover the capital costs of the initial operating segment. And we recommend the legislature withhold action on the various budget proposals pending the receipt of this full funding plan for the initial operating segment.
Okay. Yeah.
Mr. Chair, if I could offer one other kind of broad comment as well. It seems like the type of analysis that each of the members has essentially asked for is a sensitivity analysis. So, for example, with the rail modernization piece, we're talking about $50 million right now, but what happens if you were to move some of the pieces of the pie around, increase the rail mod piece to, say, a little bit more? It's that type of analysis that really needs to be done in order for the legislature to have some type of assurance that you're going to get the greatest return on investment. And that's the recommendation that we've made to the legislature, to direct the administration to develop those types of metrics and that type of analysis so that you can be assured that you're getting the greatest return.
I think what I'm looking at is this, okay? Okay, we got one project that's got a continuous appropriation, so they're requesting. And probably that's, if you're going to fund a project, you got to do that, okay? Either you start building the thing, you can't just allocate it on a year by year, or even a 3 years by 3 years basis. Doesn't work. That's not the way things are when you start building a project of that big of magnitude. But if you're allocating the other projects on a year by year basis, you're really not going to fund any large magnitude or significant projects. So what would be the revenue estimates over 10 years? What are we looking at over a large period of time for transportation if it's 40% of the carbon problem in our state that our kids are breathing, and all that? What is the plan? I talk about it more in terms of a plan than a budget allocation. What is the plan? So that's the way I would approach it. If you're going to fund transit, you should do it in terms of here's the projects that have the most significant carbon reduction we could fund over 10, 15-year period of time, and here's the high-speed rail project. Look at all these different projects like you were talking about, and we look at them and try to piece together something that is a common sense approach. Okay, so you can't do it, buddy. Transit doesn't work. You can't fund transit on a year-by-year basis. Can't even buy buses on a year-by-year basis anymore. And I'll point out another thing is, I'm all excited about the electrification because, quite frankly, having gone to school and have the track of my high school next to the Caltrain diesel engine and having the coach say, okay, you have to run 2 miles, and running around that track when the trains go by wasn't too fun when those old trains are spewing out all kinds of pollution when I went to high school. So I'm kind of like real personally sensitive about the carbon's emission from diesel, either passenger or freight trains. So I think there's some really valid options. Now, if we did a major expansion of the rail project, and say we did the high-speed rail as well, how would that enhance the passengers that get on the high-speed rail project? So if we look at the option, we want to look at the option, the bigger picture option, how it would enhance the passenger capacity of the high-speed rail project. Would it increase if we had a multitude of connectors?
Senator, no question, and I think that was really a key point, back in 2012 when we went through the business planning process, revised the plan, and ultimately the package that the legislature approved was not just about the high-speed rail system. It was about this statewide rail program, because ultimately they work together. Again, I'll use the parallel with the interstate system. It makes no sense to build an interstate system unless you have, arterials and local streets. It's the same with the rail system. You have to have them all working together. And there's no question that there's synergy in both directions, that the availability of an inter-regional system like high-speed rail promotes greater use of local transit and vice versa. There's just no question. So I think, back to a point Brian made earlier, I think, certainly from our perspective, this should not be an either-or discussion. It's a question of finding a balance and figuring out how to move forward on all fronts.
Okay, I think the planning part is very important.
I think if we had all the money in the world, or even a substantial amount, that you're absolutely right. But California has not developed a particularly effective rail system. Certainly, I know to get from Santa Barbara to Sacramento on the train takes about 9 hours. That's not going to get too many people to jump on the train. If we had a high-speed rail, I'm sure it'd be a lot faster. But the point is that if we're going to make intelligent decisions, budget-based decisions, which I know are very important to this governor and should be to all of us, we need to have that information and be able to make choices, because to have both systems absolutely would be the best of all possible worlds. But we just don't. We're starting sort of at the beginning when it comes to high-speed rail. There may be other options as we move in that direction that could get us there in a way that is less, it's transformative. I don't think there's a dispute, but is that what we and where we should be going right now? And given the amount of money that we've received so far from cap and trade, I don't know where we're going to make up that $21 billion shortfall. And what is it about? We've had 5 auctions. We've got about $500 million that we've raised. That is going to take us a long time. I don't know what, whether those are anomalies or what we're expecting in the future, but if that's where we're looking for the money, the shortfall, we're in trouble. So maybe we need to shift gears. But I don't think there's a dispute about the concept. I think the question is the money right now and the increase in costs, and maybe there are better ways to get to that result given our financial circumstances. That's what I want to know, and I think that's what the chair is asking for.
And what are the projections over long-term for the cap and trade? I mean, the Department of Finance gave us essentially 1 year, right? So why don't you guys come up with a projection? You do that?
I think in terms of making projections around cap and trade, it's obviously difficult. I mean, you essentially are trying to evaluate future markets. That said, you can certainly bound the potential allowance prices. We know that there's a set floor price and a ceiling price, and you can come up with some assumptions. And we did include some of those assumptions in our cap and trade write-up.
Okay, I'd like to see that. All right. Senator Nielsen, great. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. These are very hard questions, but we're all asking the same ones, and that is, you know, this is an enormous venture. Can we justify it? And we have got to explore all options. One that's kind of been a curiosity to me is to, what are the number of kilowatts to run that train between San Francisco and Los Angeles? Do we have any data on that alone? The kilowatts?
I mean, which,
We do. I don't have the number of...
say between San Jose and
San Francisco and Los Angeles.
Los Angeles. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, Senator, I'd be happy to provide that for you. I don't know that number off the
See,
top of my head.
but to me, that's a very fundamental requirement. We're looking at electrical energy generation capacity, importation into California, and transmission. And could we better use that electricity for other purposes? That's a whole other issue, but I'd certainly like to interject that into the discussion today. So again, the point being, we need to very critically look at it and not just go whole hog and here we go, we're going to build a train. There are many questions that need to be answered and many things that need to be justified to the highest degree of comfort for us to embark on such a huge expenditure. Isn't it $350 million a year out of the general fund right now we're obliging for just the initial high-speed rail? Something like $350 million a year?
No.
It's my understanding that currently there's no general fund allocations for...
Okay, I'm sorry, I misstated. Bond fund.
Federal.
Yeah.
Currently, there's $6.8 billion in Proposition 1A funds for the initial segments for the iOS and $3.3 billion in federal funds.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. We'll get the information and maybe come up with a hybrid. You want to call it that? I hate to use the word hybrid because we're going to the next section. It's the Air Resources Board, and we're going to talk about zero-emission cars. And I'd like to welcome the Air Resources Board, Richard Corey, our Director, Air Resources. And so this is very exciting, so you answer our questions. Thank you. And thanks for coming down.
Thank you, Chairman and members. I'm here today to discuss ARB's budget proposal for $200 million in fiscal year 2014-15 for low-carbon transportation projects, such as zero-emission cars, hybrid and zero-emission trucks and buses, and advanced technology freight demonstrations. These proposed low-carbon transportation projects are consistent with the recommendations of the 3-year investment plan that the administration put forward last year pursuant to AB 1532, and the draft update to the AB 32 scoping plan currently open for public comment. Now, petroleum use in the transportation sector is a significant contributor to the state's regional and local air pollution, as well as the state's GHG emissions. In order to meet California's post-2020 federally mandated health-based air quality standards and to help maintain GHG emission reductions beyond 2020, ARB is pursuing an aggressive transformation of the vehicle fleet, which includes significant market penetration of zero and near zero emission vehicles. Incentives are a key strategy to meeting these important air quality and climate goals. The proposed investment categories are potential funding, potential funding breakdowns are currently being identified and evaluated in a public process that we're going through. We're proposing $120 million for zero-emission and plug-in hybrid electric passenger vehicles. $20 million of this funding will specifically target disadvantaged communities, including the replacement of older and higher-emitting vehicles with near-zero emission technologies or other vehicles, pilot car sharing projects, clean public fleets, and financing assistance in these communities. Those are all areas that are being worked on. $30 million to help California fleets offset the higher upfront cost of purchasing medium and heavy-duty hybrid and zero-emission trucks and buses. And $50 million to support the development and demonstration a transformational zero and near zero emission advanced goods movement technologies near California ports, rail yards, distribution centers, airports, and freeways, basically population density centers, and particularly areas of where disadvantaged communities tend to be located as well. These funding breakdowns represent a mix of projects that achieve near-term GHG and air pollution reductions, benefit disadvantaged communities, promote the use of clean fuels and technologies, and support the market transition to a zero and near zero emission fleet. To help achieve the SB 535 goals, AIRB has set a preliminary target of providing 50% or $100 million of the low carbon transportation funding to projects that benefit disadvantaged communities. Most of these benefits would be from the reduction in toxic and criteria emissions that result from switching from petroleum-based fuel to zero and near zero emission cars, trucks, buses, and other clean freight technology operating in and around disadvantaged communities near the Southern California, Bay Area, and Central Valley freight transportation corridors. As part of the $200 million proposal, AIRB is requesting to use a portion of the monies to fund 15 positions and $200,000 in contract support. These resources would be engaged in developing detailed project implementation requirements, solicitation materials, project selection, grant agreements, ongoing project monitoring, and other incentive program-related tasks. AIRB is proposing to integrate these new resources into our existing incentive program administration, leveraging existing staff and resulting in significant state cost savings. Total new source, or rather total new state administrative costs for low carbon transportation funding are anticipated to be only about 1% of the total $200 million, because we'll be leveraging these existing programs. To measure project success, AIRB will estimate potential GHG reductions for the project categories I called out based on quantification methods from existing AIRB incentive and regulatory programs, and along with data from recent studies for advanced technologies. AIRB staff is also currently working with stakeholders as part of the public process to define the metrics such as clean vehicle market penetration or manufacturer cost reductions, which signal when funding amounts could be modified or other changes could be made to increase program effectiveness. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today, and we'd be happy to answer any questions.
Well, I had the 3 questions I wanted you to answer. We know about the program, okay? But we want to know 3 questions. And I asked them at the beginning, and I want answers to these questions. You didn't answer them, so I'll read them again. The amount of the greenhouse gases that will be reduced as part of this proposal, how will the amount be quantified, and how quickly can those reductions begin? That's the 3 questions. So, we're trying to make a decision here. We need to know that information.
All right, let me amplify.
That's what we need.
And take these.
From everybody. I know all your projects. I read them all. I know exactly what you're doing. I don't need to go over it again. We just need to know. If we're going to make a decision on all these different ideas, we want to have that information.
Fair enough. Let me take.
We gotta put nexus on this thing before we approve it.
Let me take those one at a time.
Do that. I don't. There's no nexus. You don't give me the information.
So one at a time, and I'll be brief on the setup and then get to the heart of the question.
Right.
What we're talking here is about clean transportation. We know transportation fuels represent 40% of the GHG emissions in California. We know that it represents 80% of the NOx and about 90% of the diesel PM. We also know that these projects went through a public vetting process when we developed the investment plan that started back in 2012, was transmitted in response to 1018, and was transmitted to the legislature in 2013. These projects in this budget are consistent with those that were called out, and specifically, the opportunities for reductions of GHG and other pollutants by virtue of electric vehicles, the point that you made earlier. Those incentive programs reduce GHG emissions. They advance the purposes of AB 32. In fact, they also reduce emissions of other pollutants, those that lead to formation of ozone. The freight-related projects that I talked about not only reduce GHG emissions and NOx, they'll reduce diesel PM, and it also matters where they'll reduce those emissions. They'll reduce those emissions near disadvantaged communities and where people live. But to the heart of your question, well, what's the tons?
I have numbers.
What's the tons? Here's how this. But the way I qualify this, it's really important, and that is that from a process standpoint, the way we'll proceed is through a solicitation. That is a public process in terms of getting the most competitive projects. In other words, to answer, we could certainly have a bounding exercise, but to put a point on it, you need to have conducted the solicitation, you need to have conducted the awards, you need to continue to track projects. So the reason that you don't get from me, here's the number. The number is a function of those awards and a very targeted, effective solicitation that follows from an appropriation. So do we have a game plan provided we get the appropriation? We absolutely do for those three categories that we'd follow. Do we have guidelines that we'd follow that would go through a public process in our board? We absolutely do. Would there be a transparent process in terms of the awarding of those grants and an ongoing tracking? The answer to all those questions is absolutely yes.
You got to give us a range?
Excuse me?
Can you give us any numbers?
I'm going to give you,
I'm like...
yeah, Chairman, let me respond very... let me respond...
Question. I want to know, you don't want to do it, it sounds like.
No, well, I want to be as responsive as I can because it's a very reasonable and fair question. What I'm describing is
Cowbell here.
What I'm describing is the need for the process to select the projects. If the question was, can you provide a bound, a range? I think that's a reasonable.
Come on,
Sure.
please.
In a follow-up, that would be something we could pull together.
That's good. He's going to do it. I know. He does a great job. And you got the right, I think you got the right things, but you know, when I look at this, I'm going to look at like, okay, and I kind of intuitively, hey, this is a good idea, okay, but I need to have the numbers. We need to have those numbers.
We understand that.
And we, you know, I'm pretty serious about it because, you know, I mean, you know, I don't want to spend 5 years defending a lawsuit because we didn't have the numbers when we did this hearing. You get what I'm saying? I mean, you know, this program could be collapsed because we're just throwing money at projects everybody believes is good, and we all know this is the good stuff, you know.
I understand the interest and need, and I think the range approach, because of the uncertainties that I defined, is something that we could do. But
Not in the Assembly here. You're in the Senate. You know.
Easy on that one.
Well, you know, I mean, I just have to say, having served in the Assembly for 6 years, I love those people.
Let me just jump in. If I could jump in and save you here, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, you could save me.
Thank you. Always happy to help my chair. A couple things. Since you don't have numbers today, when you do come back with some numbers, would you also include the whole idea of diesel and diesel vehicles? We all know that they are a major source of health problems as well as air quality problems. Would you also identify for us what the GHG reductions would be if the program were predominantly in removing diesel vehicles or at least modernizing? I know there are some ways to capture most of the emissions from diesel. If you would do that, that would be helpful. And also, you mentioned freight. I wonder if this includes vessel speed reduction credits. I happen to know that as we get these vehicles coming into our ports, you know, using that bunker fuel, which is a terrible air contaminant, that in my district they speed up because once they get to LA they have to slow down because there's a speed limit there. And it's the primary source, to my shock, of we've got air quality problems in my district in Santa Barbara because of the fast speeds by which these freight vehicles just pump out their bunker fuel, and it creates a serious problem, which we shouldn't have if we could do something about that. So the credits that are there, I know it's a problem in Long Beach and other parts of Los Angeles. I'm sure it's a problem in the Bay Area as well with these various ports. What kind of savings would that get us? Again, so that we can identify, perhaps we need to put the emphasis on the right syllable, as they used to say. Let's get this money, getting the best bang for our buck that we can, even though, of course, there are public hearings that they're all appropriate, but you know, knowledge is power, and knowledge will help us make the best decisions. And since this gives us an opportunity, since you don't have numbers, if you would pencil out what those numbers would, what the cost would be and the benefits in GHG reduction, that'd be very helpful.
We'll do the best we can on that, providing the caveats that I laid out.
Certainly.
I think he's got it. You're going to come back in writing. Well, I think that's fine. You know what kind of I think about this proposal? Intuitively, I kind of wonder why, you know, you say 200 million. I wonder what would happen if we increased that? Would we be able to reduce even more? I mean, I kind of look at this the way I kind of look at the rail. And we have like 3 pieces of legislation that went through the Transportation Committee yesterday that were very good pieces of legislation that deal with these issues. So I kind of look at this as, okay, if I had some numbers here, this is maybe one area I want to really look at to see if this could be a more cost-effective, maybe a cost-effective strategy versus maybe some other strategies. I don't know. I mean, I can't tell making the decision unless I see what you got. So you got to show me.
Fair enough, and I think part of the discussion, and it's one that was reflected, and I think it was AB 1532 and SB 535, it's this factor of not only GHG reductions, but it was the reference that Senator Jackson made, and that is many of the strategies that I'm talking about not only produce GHG reductions, but you get diesel PM, and you get NOx reductions that South Coast and San Joaquin dearly need to meet health-based ozone levels. And those strategies, basically, you get a triple benefit from the application of a number of these.
Plus, you could put 50% in low-income area. That's impressive.
And that is a target, and we think we can deliver on that. And the reason for that is because if you look at the population distribution centers where those diesel equipment are located, you're talking ports, rail yards, other related distribution centers, airports, and we think there's significant opportunities to reduce near source exposure to diesel as well as the GHG reductions.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. I think voting on this down the road, I want to see the numbers, and I'm kind of interested in, I don't know, Senator Jackson and others, if we had programs that could be looked at as the most, which ones are the most cost effective. I'm interested in the freight. We don't have a port in San Jose, but there are ports in the Bay Area, Oakland, and so forth. And a lot of the ships come in and they sort of idle in port, you know. And some ports in other parts have the plug-in, you know, to the ship so that they can avoid sitting there in port with the diesel oil. Is that part of this?
Yeah, in fact,
ports to plug in.
Your characterization, and I'll do.
I'm kind of like broadly talking about this because I'm familiar with this.
Yeah, and I'll cover this very quickly, but I think it's a really important point, and that is that if you consider the range of strategies that have been implemented, particularly near ports, that get at health-based diesel particulate and ozone foreign pollutants.
The Oakland port is right next to one of their low-income areas.
That's correct. And if you look,
and I think Long Beach and some of these other areas.
And the strategies that have been.
Would like to have cleaner air. That might help. I don't know.
The strategies have been employed to clean the fuel. A or B, state regulations to go lower sulfur to clean the fuel. 2, the plug-in shore power, which has also significantly reduced near shore exposures. and also the range of measures that have already been implemented to reduce diesel exposure, particularly near those disadvantaged communities. And I want to make this point because I think it's really relevant here. Since 2005, if you look at our busiest ports and look at the near source exposure to diesel PM, by virtue of the measures that have been adopted, and these basically turnover of diesel equipment through regulation and other incentives, the risks, near source risks have been reduced by 70%, but they're still way too high. And that's really what the remaining challenge is. And that's why we think that many of the technologies, the response is not, in our view, a cleaner diesel engine. In many cases, it's a zero-emission vehicle. It's an electric vehicle, or in some cases, it's a hybrid by virtue of the duty cycle. That's what's ultimately going to move us in the right direction, and these strategies help do that.
I had one more question for you. Like when we're analyzing this and getting numbers, I know some of these other guys are going, oh my God, he's going to ask me those questions. How am I going to answer them? Can you devise a way of helping some of these other departments, because you're the Air Resources Board, you're the experts on this subject. Can you help us develop these estimates, working with all your colleagues in the other departments to really get a better quantification of the greenhouse emissions reductions that we're trying to measure here?
Okay, short answer is we'll do the best we can, but I want to have two elements to my response. First element is the near-term request that you made of me and you're going to be making of the others.
Do that.
And that is that they'll have a similar caveat that, well, they will have to go through a process and a selection of projects, so it's probably a bounding exercise because there's certain constraints about that.
You can do a range.
But then the other element of your question, it's related to a resource request we have made and that you'll be considering at a subsequent hearing, and that is on an ongoing basis. We think the continued monitoring of the GHG reductions and other benefits associated with the appropriations that are ultimately made by the legislature are going to be key. It's an area where we're seeking some support because we think having clear, consistent methodologies that are applied across the agencies, having a clear, consistent reporting system that's transparent, that the public has access to and can see what projects have been awarded and where they are, is a critical element to the ultimate success of the program and something we have put a proposal forward.
You know, when I talk to some 13-year-old about this, okay, in Silicon Valley, of course, he goes, where's your R&D? Okay, is that what you're talking about? Having a staff that can look into the future to figure out any new technology that might help us reduce carbon emissions and really develop policies so that we could be in touch with the new technology reality that's happening.
Yeah.
Looking to the future for that young 13-year-old that wants to get into.
Well, we would like to hire that 13-year-old.
He's working for me now. No. Volunteer. That's what he said. He said, "Where's your R&D?"
It's a great question. What you see in the proposals are those that will yield advanced AB32 and yield reductions, and many of them yield co-benefits. But I'm going to give one example, and recognizing that even thinking about that question, I think the place to start, where are the largest emissions, where are the largest opportunities? And there certainly is a range of research projects going on across the country and the world. But going very specifically at that, I talked a little bit about the freight-related projects. The freight-related projects, particularly pilot projects, are demonstration projects. Basically, they're intended to see an opportunity to employ a technology to incent what otherwise wouldn't have happened, to demonstrate that technology, and if it's effective, in the end, expectation that the applications of, for instance, a zero-emission rubber-tired gantry crane, which has large emissions near ports, for instance, you can deploy it. You can successfully carry that project out. It ends up serving as a vessel for multiplying and being used elsewhere. And that's really the objective behind the freight-related pilot projects, is have targeted projects that provide the incentive for what to occur that otherwise wouldn't, demonstrate it, and basically capitalize on a broader deployment of those technologies. The costs come down, the emission reductions occur. So in a sense, that's not technically R&D, but as a field demonstration that's necessary for ultimately for the technologies to be embraced and ultimately used.
Okay, thank you for coming here. And we'll get the response. Thank you. I appreciate for my tough questions. It's very tough on you guys, but appreciate it. Okay, Mike McCoy is coming up from the Strategic Growth Council. Mike, welcome.